Okay, we're continuing with the web components. We're now going to move into looking at the slotted. And remember, we saw before how we could literally just style it using the slot tag itself. Here, for example, we have our business card and it's got 3 slots: first, title, email. So we can actually just use regular CSS selectors to style this. And let me just comment this out. That doesn't work in this particular studio. Let me just delete this. And if we have a look at this one, we can see that we are styling various slots. Let's see which slots we're styling. We're styling the email and the title slot. The email is green, the title should be purple. Well, we can see that here. Notice we have an H3 tag which is not styled by the page level H3 rule. If we look up top here, we have an H3 rule on the page, but it doesn't bleed in to the component. If we wanted to do that, we'd have to pass in variables. So this is the scoping both ways of CSS. So if we wanted to make that H3 element here with color, we would actually just have to come here and go H3 color red. If we do that, you'll see now it is styled, but it's not styled from the page. But we can pass in CSS custom variables in. So if we wanted to allow people to style it from outside, we would go back to using our custom CSS variables. And we can see the slot text here. Now, if I revert back to what we had before, you can also use this pseudo selector. The pseudo selector basically is like a function. It says if slotted has dot first, a class of first on it, color it orange. So if we come back here, we can see orange is now here. So you can use effectively some rules, and it's any CSS selector here. But one thing to note is it's shallow. It doesn't go into nested components. So if we look at our page down below, we can see we've got a nested element. But if we try to target that nested element in the slot, it isn't going to work because it's only a shallow selector. So to bear that in mind, but obviously you could style this as this is on the page through page level CSS if you wanted to, or passing custom variables. So that's a slotted text. Now we've seen before when we were in the CSS Lite how we kind of styled using the My Component selector. Up top here we saw the My Component selector. But when we're inside the component, we can't really use that My Component selector simply because we're inside. So the way we can do that is use what's called the host selector, just 1 colon, and it will pick up if it's like a function. It says, firstly, it can say anything with the show host ID, make it red. So if we come into our page up here, ID has show host, it's colored red. If we look at the HTML, we can see we've got a show host ID, show host 2. We've also got a card with class equals cool. So when we're in there, what we're doing is we're saying if anything has the show host on it, do it red. But we can also use this as almost like a function that says if they're on the host element, it has the class important, any div elements inside should be colored orange with a font weight of bold. So if we look at this now, and if we look at our div, we will see we have the card here, but we'll have this one here. If we look at that, there, all of that is in orange. And we must also remember that the light DOM will always override the shadow CSS. What does that mean? So if we've got the div, let's just change the div up top here and call, because remember, one thing we have to remember with the host. So let's put div here and we'll make that color red, see if that makes any difference. That doesn't affect it. In here, let's take that out. Should actually make that a different color. Let's make that green. That's not affecting it. Now, Light DOM does override the shadow CSS in the rules that are actually sort of allowed on the component level, but not with this host. So what we can see here is if we want to style the host element based on what properties are placed on the actual element itself. Notice we're putting these attributes. We're saying style this card with these style sheet if it has the attribute of show host or class equals cool. So let's do the class equals cool. If we come down here, this is in green. Why is that in green now? So if we come back up, we have host, and if it's got the cool class, green bold 44 pixels. So that's the host element. One other thing we can do is what's called the host context. This is it here, and what this basically does is saying that if on the page the web component is in an element or a tag that has some attribute, here we've got the ID show context, change the color depending on where it is in the page. So this idea of ID has show context. So if we come back up here, what we're doing is we're saying that if the web component is in something that has an ID selector of show context, or if it's in a tag that has a class of a certain kind of attribute, we can use any CSS selector here. Make sure that the div is now green, bold, and twice the size. And we can see down here, this is in the show context. If I take this out and replace it with S, now that doesn't actually do it, simply because it's not in that context. So let's change that again. Show context. Sorry, I'm in the wrong page. Let's just go here, open this up, open with live server. Div element, there it's green, because it's in the show context. So we've said that if it is in something that has an ID of show context, if we take this off, if we actually know what we'll do, if we come in here and actually change this, just call it, take that out, call it ID equals text, we will see now that that doesn't apply. So reverting back, do that, it's in that context, and we can use any attributes. These are all CSS selectors. So when we're up top here, what we can do is if we want to make this rule, this becomes effectively a whole rule. It says using host context, if the web component has either an ID or an attribute name or a class of something in here, shape this particular div in this way. Or if you don't have this, it will basically do everything inside. So let's save this. Let's have a look at the page. We're back to normal. If we come back here, take off the div, Control X, it's done everything now within the web component. So if you just want to just basically only do the div rather than do everything, we can then have a kind of filter. So basically this is a new form of CSS selection rule. And finally, I have this diagram here that I have in the things to try and explain all the different things. Red is the light CSS. So you can obviously to remember that whatever's in the slot is at the boundary of the web component, of the shadow DOM and the light DOM. So the light CSS actually has it. This is actually in the light DOM, although it's projected into the component. We can basically use the host context depending on where it sits in the page. We can do the host itself based on any CSS selector, either the ID or the class. We also have a span slot selector. For example, if we use this with the slot, this will do anything that has a span inside the slot will be using the basically CSS style. So in our slot, if we have a span, a div, an h1, we can target areas within tags within the slot using this selector, but it's only the top level, not anything deep within the actual tag that we're using. So as I say, there can be lots of little different rules. I personally my preferred method is to use this using the import. I think that's kind of nice. That can have a one style sheet that I use across the board and basically define certain things. And if I want to do specific things within the web component, I tend to maybe just use an internal kind of style rules here rather than actually focusing on slots and hosts and things like that. But it's up to you and you can play around with that. So a tricky one, CSS, but that is the second part of the CSS and concludes the module on CSS in web components.